I was the one making mortgage payments for 6 years, yet my name never appeared on the deed. I didn't find out from a lawyer. I didn't even find out from my parents. I overheard it. They were in the kitchen, just down the hall from my old childhood bedroom where I was visiting for the weekend. I had come to drop off groceries and help fix a leaking faucet. The house I paid for. The house that was supposed to be mine. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but my mother speaks loudly when she's talking on speakerphone, especially with people she respects. Yes, the house is under James's name. She'll understand. She always does. I froze, my hand still wet from the faucet. She's not the type to make a fuss. Honestly, James needs the stability more than she does. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. James, my younger brother, unemployed for almost a year, fresh out of a divorce and currently sleeping in the guest room of my parents' actual house, the one across town. He needs the stability. I dried my hand slowly, like if I moved too fast, the moment might disappear. I felt my own name being erased, syllable by syllable, right there on the kitchen tile. My name is Julia Carson. I'm 31, a third-grade teacher, and the kind of person who sends thank you notes for gifts that weren't that thoughtful. I drink black coffee, but add too much sugar, and I've been paying off this house since I was 25. I never asked my parents for much except for this one thing, trust. I didn't say anything that night. We had dinner, like always. Mum made meatloaf. Dad opened a bottle of red wine. James was cheerful. He asked me about work, about whether I was still dating that guy who worked in real estate. I smiled politely and said he had moved away. You'll find someone, Mum added, refilling my water. Someone who won't mind that you work too much. It wasn't meant to hurt, but it did. It always does. I drove home late, windows half open. No music, just that one sentence looping in my head. She'll understand. I did understand. I understood that no matter how much I provided, how quietly I sacrificed, I would never be seen as the one who needed protection. I was the daughter who had it together, the one who didn't need, and so they gave what was mine to someone else, because they thought I'd be okay. I parked in front of the house, my house, the one I bought 6 years ago when my credit was shaky, and my parents offered to help by putting it under their name temporarily. Just until you're on your feet, they'd said. We'll sign it over when the loan stabilizes. I had believed them, because they were my parents. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in my own living room, staring at the walls. I painted myself the couch I had moved in on my own, the mortgage statement sitting in a drawer with every check written from my account. I opened my laptop, logged into the county records portal, typed in the address, hit search, and there it was. Primary owner James M. Carson. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I just stared at the screen for a long, long time. Then I hit print, folded the document, slipped it into a plain white envelope. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it, but I knew one thing: I couldn't unhear what I had heard. And I couldn't unknow what I now knew. She'll understand. That's the last time anyone says that about me without consequence. I stared at the screen for a while after that. Not because I didn't believe it, I did. Somewhere deep down, I had known the truth the moment I heard her voice. But it still landed like a quiet betrayal you see coming in a dream, and still can't stop. Primary owner James M. Carson. I read it once, then again. The page didn't change. No asterisk, no shared ownership. Just a name that wasn't mine on a house I had cleaned. Gutters on painted walls enshoveled the driveway for during 2 different blizzards. I clicked around, hoping for a mistake. A line, I'd missed a name in the notes section, maybe an error in filing. But it was consistent. His name on the title. My address, his ownership. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. My hands felt oddly calm on the keyboard. I downloaded the file, checked the footer to see the last update date. It had been filed over a year ago. A full year. I had been living under the illusion of shared trust while they had already officially handed it over. Quietly, without a word. I printed the document, the whir of the printer loud in the stillness of my home. I folded the sheet neatly into thirds and slid it into a plain white envelope I found in my kitchen drawer next to the spare batteries and expired coupons. I didn't write anything on it. Not yet. I stared at the envelope a few seconds longer than I needed to, then placed it on my nightstand like a silent threat or awaiting truth. I went to bed, but didn't sleep. I just lay there watching the red digits of the alarm clock change every few minutes. I thought about every conversation I'd had with my parents in the past 6 months, every time I'd mentioned the house, the repairs I'd made, the rising insurance. None of them had flinched. Not once. I thought about James, how he visited, maybe once every few months stayed for dinner, didn't ask how things were going. Maybe they thought because I hadn't asked for anything, I didn't need anything. Maybe they thought silence was agreement. But silence is not consent, and ignorance isn't peace. I remembered the day I first bought the house. Well, when I moved in anyway. The paperwork had gone through my parents because my credit at 25 had been trash after student loans and one co-signed disaster with an old boyfriend. My mum had said, "It's just temporary, honey. We'll help you get started." And I had trusted that. Not because she was my mother, but because at the time it had felt like the only way forward. Now I realised that the only thing more dangerous than blind trust is earned trust that gets quietly misused. At 8 a.m. the next morning, I poured coffee into a travel mug and picked up the envelope. It felt heavier than paper. I didn't know if I would actually bring it up. I wasn't ready for the confrontation, but I couldn't not bring it with me. It was my safety net, my proof. I drove to my parents' house with the envelope sitting in the passenger seat like a silent witness. The same house I'd grown up in, where we had backyard birthday parties and winter movie nights with hot chocolate. I pulled into the driveway, engine still running, and sat there for a moment watching the curtains in the front window. Nothing moved. I turned off the car and walked up the steps. The smell of cinnamon hit me. The second I opened the front door, Mum was baking again. "Julia," she called from the kitchen, "I'm making your favourite." Her voice was bright, casual, warm. I hated how much I wanted to believe it was all still normal. I smiled, a practiced habit, and said, "Smells great." I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket. I didn't pull it out. Not yet. James wasn't there that morning, which somehow made it worse. I wanted to see his face, to watch him squirm. But also, I didn't. I wasn't ready for his version of the story. I wasn't ready for his nonchalance. We sat, we ate, we talked about mundane things, weather work, my classroom. Not once did she mention the house. Not once did she ask how things were going with the mortgage. I wondered if she thought I already knew, or if she'd completely convinced herself that I'd be fine, that I'd understand. After breakfast, I helped clean up, washed dishes, dried pans. She smiled and thanked me like nothing was different. And I realised then I wasn't angry because I'd lost the house. I was angry because they'd never considered I might care, that I might feel betrayed, that I might not be the unshakable, endlessly capable daughter they'd always assumed could take any hit without flinching. That hurt more than any legal document ever could. I left the envelope in my coat pocket as I walked out. I didn't give it to her. Not yet. But I would. When I was ready not to make them feel guilty, but to make myself seen. That Saturday, I came back for dinner. I wasn't sure why. Part of me hoped something would shift. Maybe she'd bring it up on her own. Maybe there was some missing piece I didn't know yet. A paperwork delay, a conversation I had forgotten, an assumption they had made in good faith. I told myself I was giving her the benefit of the doubt, but maybe I was just looking for a reason to still believe in them. I arrived 15 minutes early with a bottle of wine in one hand and the envelope still tucked in my coat pocket. She was in the kitchen, her hair up apron on, humming something old and familiar. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the house. She turned when I walked in and smiled like I was any other guest. Perfect timing. "Can you set the table?" I nodded, taking plates from the cabinet, the motion automatic. Every item had its place, just like it always did. James showed up 10 minutes later, his voice too loud, cracking jokes that didn't quite land. He kissed Mom on the cheek and asked if she'd remembered to make the sweet potatoes the way he liked them. She had. We sat down, 4 plates, folded napkins, candles lit, even though it was barely dark out. Dad poured wine. We passed dishes around. Conversation was light. James talked about maybe getting back into consulting. Dad asked about my school year. I answered politely, gave them the version of my life that required the least explanation. I waited for an opening. A pause, long enough to say what I needed to say. Halfway through dinner, I reached into my coat still draped over the back of my chair and pulled out the envelope. I set it on the table beside my water glass. My fingers tapped it once. That was enough to draw my mother's eye. She glanced at it, then at me. "What's that?" she asked casually, wiping her hands on her napkin. "Just something I wanted to talk about," I said. I wasn't ready to open it. I needed her to meet me halfway. She didn't. Instead, she looked back at James and said, "You know, I was just telling your aunt that you've had a rough couple of years. I mean, between the divorce and losing the job, it's a lot. And now trying to get back on your feet." She trailed off, then added, "That house will give you stability. You need a win." I didn't speak, I just looked at her. Her tone was soft motherly, as if she were explaining a perfectly reasonable decision. Then she turned to me, smiling gently, and said, "And you're still living there, right? I mean, nothing's changing for you." I felt the air shift. My fork was still in my hand, suspended above the mashed potatoes I no longer had the appetite for. "I thought we were going to talk about the title," I said quietly. "It came out smaller than I wanted." She waved a hand like brushing away a gnat. "It's just paperwork. You've always been so responsible, we knew you'd be okay." It made more sense this way. For now. I looked across the table at James. He didn't look at me. He was focused on his plate. Knife, fork, chew, sip. As if this conversation wasn't happening. As if the house he now owned by name wasn't paid for by me. The envelope was still on the table. I slid it forward 1/2 inch, then stopped. My hand hovered there, fingers resting on the flap. Then I pulled it back and placed it on my lap, out of sight. I didn't want to perform this fight. Not here. Not like this. I excused myself before dessert. Said I had an early morning. No one tried to stop me. No one asked why I barely touched my plate. At the door, my mum offered leftovers, and I shook my head. James stayed at the table scrolling through his phone. I walked out without hugging anyone. I didn't say goodbye. That was a first. I didn't go straight home. I drove past my street and kept going until the neighbourhoods got quieter, darker. Somewhere around the edge of town, I pulled into an empty supermarket parking lot and turned off the engine. I just sat there, hands on the wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. The silence wrapped around me tight and familiar. It was the same kind I'd grown used to over the years, the kind that follows you when you don't complain, when you don't ask, when you tell yourself, "I'll be fine." I used to wear that like a badge. When I bought the house, I was 25 and drowning in student loans. I was teaching full-time tutoring on weekends and working summers just to make ends meet. The apartment I was in had mould in the bathroom ceiling and a landlord who ignored calls. I found the listing on a Tuesday, 2 bedrooms, old floors, cracked siding, but solid bones and a backyard. I remember showing it to my parents at their kitchen table. I had printed it out, highlighted the parts that mattered: proximity to my school price per square foot, estimated utilities. I wanted them to see how much I had thought it through. My mum squinted at the numbers, then at me. "Your credit score still needs work," she said gently. "You've been late on those Sally Mae payments." I nodded, already knowing. "But we could help," she added, "just for the purchase. We could put it under our name until things settle." I remember pausing, not because I didn't trust them, but because I didn't want to need them. I had worked so hard to not need anyone, but I also knew I couldn't get approved alone. Not then. "We'll sign it over when the time's right," she had said, patting my hand. "You just get in there and start building your life." That was the phrase she used, start building, like the house would be my foundation. And for a long time it was. I painted the walls myself sage green in the living room, off-white in the kitchen. I planted hydrangeas out front. I spent weekends sanding old furniture I found on Craigslist. I made that house mine in every way except legally. And it never crossed my mind that anyone would see it differently. That my name not being on the deed would one day become not just a technicality, but a choice. Their choice. I kept thinking about that moment at the dinner table, the way she said, "You're still living there," right as if the house was some shared community space, not the place I poured every paycheck into. As if proximity was proof of ownership. I wondered if maybe I had made it too easy for them. Maybe because I didn't complain, because I didn't ask for help, because I always figured things out. They assumed I didn't need fairness. I could almost hear her voice in my head. "You're so independent, Julia." And maybe that was the problem. Maybe independence made me invisible. I leaned my head against the window, the glass cool against my skin. The streetlights buzzed in the distance. I thought about how often I had chosen silence over conflict, how often I'd nodded instead of arguing, how many times I had told myself, "Just get through it. You'll be okay." And I was okay, mostly. But being okay doesn't mean it didn't hurt. I looked at the envelope on the passenger seat, still unopened, still waiting. Not for them this time, it was waiting for me. For whatever version of myself would finally say, "This is not what I deserve." I sat in the car for another 15 minutes before driving home. When I got there, I didn't unpack. I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood in the middle of the living room, the room I'd built piece by piece, thinking it was mine. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. What if I just left? What if I walked away, not as a victim, but as someone reclaiming the right to start over? The idea sat in my chest, like a warm stone, strange, unfamiliar, but not unbearable. I wasn't ready to move yet, but for the first time I considered it. I texted James late at night a message short enough to hide the weight behind it. "Coffee, sometime this week." He replied within 5 minutes. "Sure, you pick." That fast reply, too fast, already told me he didn't suspect anything. That maybe, in his world, things were still fine between us. I chose a quiet cafe on the corner of Pine and 11th. Wooden tables, soft lighting plants hanging like tired secrets. The kind of place where people pretended to read, but mostly just watched each other think. I got there 10 minutes early. My hands were steady but cold, my throat dry even after sipping water twice. I watched the door and told myself I wasn't expecting anything. Not an apology, not clarity, not even kindness. But that wasn't true. I was hoping for something, some proof that he hadn't known, or at least hadn't meant to hurt me. At 4:06, he walked in. Same worn sneakers, leather jacket, half-zipped eyes slightly bloodshot, like he'd been out late again. "Hey, Jules," he said casually, sliding into the chair across from me. He glanced at the menu and ordered an iced coffee, no cream extra sweet. He didn't ask how I was. I looked at him for a long second before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" I said, my voice softer than I expected. He nodded, looking down at his phone as it buzzed. Did Mom and Dad put the house in your name that got him? A small flicker in his eyes. He looked up just slightly, but not directly at me. What do you mean? The deed, I said. The title. It says your name, not theirs, not mine. He blinked once, then gave a half shrug. Yeah, they asked me to hold it temporarily. I figured you knew. He said it like he was commenting on the weather. No apology, no discomfort. Just a dull explanation as if what had happened was nothing out of the ordinary. My stomach went cold. You thought I knew, I repeated. He nodded, sipping his drink. I mean, Mum said you guys had figured out a plan, that you were handling the payments and stuff. I didn't want to get in the way. I stared at him. He was holding the plastic cup with both hands, tapping his thumb against the lid. He still hadn't looked me in the eyes. You didn't think to ask me, I said. Just once. He sighed, a long, tired sound, like this conversation was inconvenient. I don't know, Julia. I've been dealing with my own stuff. It's just paperwork, right? You're still living there. That line again, still living there. I felt something inside me recoil, not from the words, but from how familiar they had become. As if my presence was a favour. As if my entire life there could be reduced to a technicality. I folded my hands together tightly in my lap to stop them from shaking. It's not just paperwork to me, I said. I've poured every dollar, every hour into that place. And no one thought I might want to be consulted. He shrugged again. I didn't mean to step on anything. I thought it was just how Mum wanted to structure things. I didn't sign anything without their input. I stared at him, something sharp and quiet rising in my chest. You didn't think for yourself, I said. You just went along with it. He looked up at me then. Finally. Julia, it's not like I tricked you or anything, I just assumed. Exactly, I cut in, you assumed. Because it was easier for you that way. The silence between us stretched. He didn't argue, didn't explain further. He just picked up his phone, glanced at the screen again, notifications lighting up. I watched his fingers move calm and detached, and it hit me harder than anything my parents had done. James didn't care enough to even lie. Not out of malice, just indifference. He'd taken something from me because it was offered, and when it caused pain, he barely flinched. That kind of detachment was worse than cruelty. At least, cruelty acknowledged your existence. I stood up slowly. My chair scraped lightly against the wooden floor. I think that's all I needed, I said. You're leaving? He asked. His tone wasn't surprised, more like mildly curious. Yeah, I said. I've got some packing to do. I didn't wait for him to say goodbye. I walked out of the cafe, the doorbell ringing faintly behind me, and stepped into the sharp afternoon sun. For a moment, I stood still on the sidewalk, breathing, letting the realization settle. There was no misunderstanding anymore, no missed conversation, no saving this from the inside. The house wasn't mine. The family I thought I had wasn't either. And that was okay, because now at least I knew what I was walking away from, and what I was walking toward. I woke up before sunrise, heart pounding so loud I thought someone was pounding on my chest rather than the alarm. The house was quiet. I could hear the furnace kick on the settling whisper of pipes, the echo of a lifetime I'd built alone. I pulled on jeans and a hoodie, grabbed my phone, and scaled down the stairs so silently it felt like betrayal. In the kitchen, the note waited where I'd left it the night before, next to my empty mug. I rewrote it 3 times, my pen rattling over the page, until finally I'd gotten it right. I sealed it in a cream envelope and taped it to the cabinet door. I don't need the keys to this house. I need the keys to myself. I stepped back and stared at those words for longer than I should have my reflection blurry in the oven door window. Then I turned and went upstairs to pack. Boxes already lined the hallway, cheap moving boxes I'd bought on sale. I pulled out framed student art, bright hearts and stick figures, and tucked them into bubble wrap, pressing my cheek against them before wrapping them carefully as if they carried pieces of my heart. On the dresser, I selected 3 photos of me in front of that kitchen island when I painted it blue, me laughing at last winter's snow day, me teaching kids to sled for the first time, me with my graduation cap. Each frame I closed with a final click. My hands trembled, but I didn't cry. There was no time. In the living room, the sofa had one cushion flattened from years of late-night grading. I hugged it once, inhaling the scent of faded upholstery and chalk dust on my coat, then pulled it off the legs and slid it into the box. I moved like a person on autopilot each step, lurching me forward from what had been into what now would be. I stopped in the hallway, noticing my shoes, well worn, Converse the right one, with a scuff that had turned white. I kicked it gently, as though it too deserved farewell. My knees felt weak when I reached the front door. I fumbled the key out of the lock and tried 2 times before it turned. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, swallowed by grief and relief at once. I slipped the keys into my pocket and stepped onto the porch, breathing in air sharpened by frost. The van was already parked across the street. I crossed over my breath, puffing tiny clouds, and started loading boxes one by one, finances, clothes, books, art supplies. A neighbour passed and gave me a small wave. No questions, no pity. I realised then that no one knew the story. It was just another moving day to them, and that felt strangely good. I closed the back doors and climbed in, taking a deep breath before sliding the address sticker off the passenger window. That sticker had said, Carson Residence. I peeled it slowly, folding it in my palm like a broken promise, then let it fall into the box. I settled into the driver's seat, started the engine, and felt the shift in perspective as I pulled away. I didn't look back. When I arrived at the studio I'd rented, I parked in the alley. The building was older, brick facade, one flickering light above the door. I unlocked it with a metal key and pushed the door open to the hollow echo of an empty room. The air smelled like varnish. The walls were raw wood, miscoloured in places. I climbed the stairs carefully, lugging boxes that felt heavier than they should sweat, catching in my hair. In the middle of the room, I paused. The space felt vast, more emptiness than home, but it was mine to fill. I set a box down, opened it, and pulled out that battered lamp, plugging it in. The bulb lit up the room in a soft yellow circle. I pulled a folding chair from another box, sat down and closed my eyes. I listened, no creaking pipes, no distant laughter, no furnace, just my breath and the gentle hum of the city somewhere far below. I felt my chest loosen, the weight crack wide enough for relief to seep through, but it left a hollow I'd have to fill thoughtfully. I opened another box and put the mugs on a battered shelf. I climbed onto the windowsill and watched the street beyond, pigeons pecking at crumbs, a car tires sloshing through a puddle, a neighbour walking a dog. I thought about how these mugs would hold my morning coffee, how this chair would hold me when I read how this room could become a place where I didn't have to explain or defend who I was. In the kitchen box, I found an old student letter thanking me for believing in them. I unfolded it and read it slowly, every word seeping into me like light. I felt tears come, but I let them stay small. I didn't sob. I just let my throat catch and my shoulders drop. I folded the letter and placed it on the small counter I'd brought my first act of unpacking. I thought about the years I'd spent defending a house that wasn't really mine, and realised this was the first time in longer than I could remember that I felt in control of what I owned and why. As night fell, I changed into soft socks and curled on the floor with a blanket. The studio was still bare, but I didn't feel lost. I felt present. I thought about the note on the kitchen back home and how the house might feel quiet, locked, empty. That was okay. It was supposed to be. And by the time the street lamp cast an amber glow through the window, I held the letter in my hand and thought, maybe the place that matters most isn't a structure, it's the permission to claim your own space. I settled down to sleep and drifted easily, not because I wasn't tired, but because I was finally allowed to be. I had left behind more than walls and keys. I had left behind a story that wasn't mine to keep, and I was free. I woke the next morning to soft sunlight filtering in through the narrow blinds of my new studio, and for the first time in months, I felt ready to build something rather than rebuild someone else's story. I started by calling the bank I'd opened an account with the week before, one I'd set up entirely on my own without parental help, with a post-it note reminder that read check credit score. I scheduled a time to go over my credit report, online student loans, small credit card balances, nothing scarier than a quiet whisper of debt I'd earned. I learned that I had a 620 score low, but not falling off a cliff into financial oblivion. I spent the afternoon on the couch surrounded by policy leaflets and online calculators, filling out forms for a secured credit card that I knew would help build my score if I used responsibly. I read about APRs, loan-to-value ratios, the difference between FHA and conventional mortgages, underlining unfamiliar terms with straight black lines, until the paper glowed with clarity under my pencil. That evening, I drove to a little home goods store 2 blocks away and bought a plain wooden frame, the kind with no design, no clutter, just clean edges. The cashier asked if it was for a picture or a diploma, and I mumbled, "Something I'm working toward." When I got home, I put it on the small desk by the window, leaned it against the wall, and left it empty. It sat there, quietly hopeful. I began using a budgeting app to track my expenses: groceries, utilities, art supplies, studio rent. I set aside 20% of my income every week for future home. I researched mortgage programs for first-time buyers and reached out to a loan officer who gently walked me through the pre-approval application and told me I'd need 6 months of consistent bank statements. I set a calendar reminder, December 10th, check payment history. I made automatic payments, reminding myself with every debit that this time I was paying for me. I still felt the weight in my chest sometimes, the ache of loss, but instead of caving, I let it fuel me. I thought about how the family I'd left would never understand these nights, spent balancing budgets, reading about credit utilization, taking every opportunity to avoid late fees. And that knowledge made me proud. One evening, I opened a spreadsheet called Dream Apartment and typed in specs: 1 bedroom, natural light hardwood floors, small balcony, quiet neighborhood. I let myself imagine what it would be like to open the door with my own key, to hang prints on walls I had chosen to brew coffee in a kitchen I owned. I remembered that empty picture frame and carefully printed a grayscale image from an online listing to slide inside. It wasn't the actual apartment yet, but it was a promise. I set the frame next to the mug I'd bought the day I left the old house and took a photo to send to a friend with a text: "Guys, I'm doing it." They sent back a string of celebration emojis that looked like confetti across the screen. I smiled, feeling lighter, steadier. Over the next few weeks, I paid off small debts, missed no payments, kept my checking account above a minimum balance. I learned to say no to takeout in favour of pasta I cooked at home. I called my loan officer when I had questions, refusing to worry that I sounded inexperienced. I told myself, you're supposed to feel inexperienced, and that was okay. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, while I was grading essays, my phone rang. It said, "New bank loan debt," in small letters I nearly didn't recognise. My heartbeat sped up as I answered. The voice on the other end said, "This is Rebecca Miller from Rivers Bank. Congratulations, you've been pre-approved for a conventional mortgage up to $250,000 pending property appraisal." I blinked and sank onto the sofa. Words bounced in my head until I realised I could feel something else. A calm clarity that this had been the quiet work of months. Not luck, not family assistance, not chance. I was watching the first real ripple of change from my own actions. I thanked Rebecca with an almost shaky voice, hung up and stared at the phone. The empty frame leapt into my vision, filled now with that grayscale promise of a future door. I stood up, walked over and touched the glass softly like it was fragile, like it was all that separated dream from reality. Tears pricked at the edges of my eyes, not tears of loss, but of triumph, of a future being built in my name, a future I had earned. I placed the phone and the frame together on my desk, leaned my forehead on my hand and whispered, "This is just the beginning." I walked into the apartment with my loan officer, Rebecca, leaning across from me quietly, reassuring every step, and my heart started fluttering like I'd show up for prom and discovered I'd forgotten the dress. The door swung open to reveal a small living room, bathed in afternoon light, pale wooden floors echoing softly underfoot, and a narrow kitchen that looked brand new. White cabinets, brushed nickel handles, enough counter space for a coffee station. The walls were the soft cream colour I'd picked out for my old home, and the windows, tall and double-hung, framed a view of budding magnolia trees, outside branches brushing against a pale blue sky. I stepped forward, the echo of my footsteps too loud, as if the apartment itself was testing the width of my presence. I pulled open a drawer in the kitchen and found its glide smooth, solid, a tiny promise of stability. I ran my fingers gently across the counter, imagining fresh vegetables waiting to be chopped. Butterflies swirled low in my stomach, but they weren't fear. They were alive. I took a breath and walked into the bedroom. The carpet soft under my footsteps, the closet deep enough to hold both my winter coats and summer dresses. The bathroom was compact but bright, with a white tiled backsplash and polished chrome fixtures. It smelled clean, like hope wrapped in bleach. I walked back to the living area, my fingers absent-mindedly brushing the walls. I'd been here only 5 minutes, but I already felt the hum of something new I could call this mine. "How does it feel?" Rebecca asked softly. I nodded, swallowing. "It feels like maybe home." She smiled and handed me a contract. I touched it reverently as though I was handing my past a verdict. We sat at the tiny breakfast bar, 2 stools laminate top, and she slid the page toward me. Buyer Julia Elaine Carson. I stared at the bold black letters, letting each one settle into me. My name on a contract. My name typed with my middle initial, not theirs. Not borrowed. My chest squeezed with a warmth that surprised me. I picked up the pen, the click as I extended it, loud in the quiet room. I paused, thumb grazing the signature line, thinking of how many names had claimed ownership of my life, my parents' James's, and how few had ever included mine. I set the pen to paper and wrote slow and deliberate Julia Elaine Carson. My hand didn't shake. It wrote like it knew its own truth. Rebecca slid across the bar and pressed the papers toward me. "Congratulations." I managed a small smile. Inside me, something gentle cracked open like dawn pushing through a shattered window. I stood, walked to the window, and opened it. The cool spring breeze came in, brushing across my cheeks, carrying the scent of earth and possibility. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, feeling sky and city quiet and infinite. I remembered standing in the old house keys jangling in my pocket, heart sinking. The contrast was bitter and beautiful. I let the air fill my lungs, then slowly exhaled, and a sense of quiet triumph settled in. I was here in a place that belonged to me, mine. No qualifiers, no lineage, just me and the permissions I'd finally learned to give myself. With the contract signed, I started planning where to place the frame with my dream apartment picture, where to hang my students' artwork, what shade of sage green to paint the living room wall. I opened my phone and typed apartment's address, move-in date, then deleted it and typed my apartment. I hit save. That felt fitting. I closed my phone and looked around at the empty space with fresh intention. This was my turning point, no longer rebuilding what someone else said I could have, but actively constructing my own foundation. I ran a hand along the windowsill and whispered to the empty room, "We did this. the future felt solid under my feet. After stepping away from the closing table, moving into the future I'd earned, I carried an invisible weight. One letter, one message I needed to send before I could fully close the door. I set up in my new living area, the space still quiet, except for the gentle hum of the streetlight outside. In front of me, the glass-topped breakfast bar held my clammy coffee mug, my phone, and a single sheet of stationery paper with creases where I'd folded it twice. I opened my laptop, heart thumping as I hit compose. In the to field, I typed my parents' email address first, then James's as a way of equalising what felt like an uneven ledger. The cursor blinked in the subject line. I stared at it so long I felt dizzy. I started with a single sentence: I am no longer living at the house on Maple Street. The sharpness of Maple Street sliced across me, memories of early morning reflections in that kitchen window, late-night teaching prep in the living room glow. I paused, my fingers hovering. I thought about my mother humming in that same kitchen, making cookies with me, the lightness in her voice, and how dreams turn heavy when they're whispered over someone else's deed. I moved on. I know you believed you were doing what was right, that assigning the title to James was meant to protect the home until my financial situation stabilised. I pictured my father's grave, nods, the polite compliments, at family dinners, the way James would flash that gentle grin when being helpful. Then I stopped because I remembered how small it felt when I realised that helping had meant erasing me from history. I swallowed hard fingertips, tracing the edges of the keyboard. I realised now that living without my name on the deed made me invisible in ways that paper lines couldn't have captured. I paused again, the silence filled with the hum of my own breath. I thought of breaking down, writing "I hate you" in all caps, but I didn't. Instead, I tapped back. I cherish the support and love behind your intentions, and I do forgive you, but I can't remain under a name that wasn't mine. My heart jumped as I typed the next line. I've learned to value boundaries more than inherited assumptions. I thought of the small frame with my dream apartment photo, the way that frame held emptiness and hope, just as this letter held goodbye and forgiveness. I closed my eyes and exhaled. I no longer live in that house, but I have not lost myself. Just one short sentence. It felt enough. I blinked back tears. My head buzzed. I had woven years of hurt, betrayal, recovery, and self-clarity into fewer than 50 words. I stared at the email for a minute that felt like an hour, my finger shaking above the send button. Memories flickered across my mind, colouring eggs with my mum in that kitchen, watching James graduate in that living room, teaching awkward math songs to third graders in the backyard. I realised I could replay those memories any time they surfaced. They were mine to keep. But I couldn't keep pretending the home was mine too. I leaned forward and clicked send. The message went away instantly, leaving silence and the faintest chime. I didn't look back. I closed the laptop and set it on Do Not Disturb. I swallowed down the sudden lump in my throat. I picked up the empty frame and stood by the open window that faced the courtyard. Cool, night air drifted in, curling around me like reassurance. I let it brush against my cheek, remembered how it once felt to step out of a place I'd been locked into by a mission, and now I was breathing free. I didn't wait for a reply or a knock on that door. I didn't watch the inbox or refresh it. Instead, I set the frame on the shelf, opened a drawer, and placed that first apartment lease inside, along with a small, handwritten note. For the years I built a house that wasn't mine. Then I took a long walk down the hallway, aware of how light each step felt. I stopped at the edge of the studio, looked at the warm glow of the desk lamp, the empty canvas on the living room wall, the breathing space beside me. No echoes from the old house. No second guessing, just quiet resolve. This letter closed a chapter, not with anger or bitterness, but with clarity and release. And as I leaned against my front door, watching the city lights shimmer in windows all around, I thought I wrote that letter, not for them, but for me. I freed myself. Then, at last, I walked inside and closed the door behind me without a backward glance. The envelope came on a Tuesday. No return address, just my name written in James's handwriting. Tight, almost apologetic script, the way he always wrote when he wasn't sure if he should be saying anything at all. I stood in the hallway for a moment, mail in hand, debating whether to even open it. I hadn't heard from them since my email. No texts, no voicemails, not even a reaction. I'd told myself that silence was its own kind of answer. But this quiet, cream-coloured envelope was something else. I brought it to the kitchen, set it next to the kettle, and let it sit there for most of the afternoon. I made tea. I cleaned out the fridge. I stood by the window, watching a boy ride circles on his bike in the courtyard. And then, without ceremony, I opened the envelope. The letter inside was written on notebook paper, not even lined up neatly. It had a smudge near the top, like his hand had hovered over it too long. It started plainly. "Julia, I'm sorry." I sat down. The kettle clicked off behind me unnoticed. The letter continued. "Not for what happened. I can't change that. I'm sorry I didn't speak up when I could have. I knew the house wasn't in your name. I didn't ask why. I assumed it was temporary, and I didn't think it was my place to interfere." I stopped reading. My eyes stayed on the page, but my thoughts drifted back to the time we repainted the living room together, me covered in specks of blue paint, James laughing as he accidentally stepped on the tray. That laugh had made me feel like family. But this sentence reminded me of the silence that had replaced it. I read on. "Mom and Dad said you knew. I told myself you were okay with it. I think I told myself that, so I wouldn't have to challenge them. The truth is I lacked courage. I was afraid of upsetting everything. I'm not proud of that." My throat tightened, not out of anger, but because something in me had waited so long to hear him say exactly that. Not a fix, not an excuse, just truth. "I read your email," he continued, "and I've never felt smaller than I did that night. Not because you shamed us, but because you didn't. You told us the truth quietly, without bitterness. And it echoed louder than any fight could have." I could almost hear his voice in the way the letters trailed off, like he wanted to stop, but knew he had to keep going. Then the line that caught me, "I hope you can forgive me before I forgive our parents." I set the letter down and stared at that sentence. It rang out heavier than apology and admission that he saw it too. The imbalance, the way love had been handed out with conditions, contracts, and quiet erasure. He hadn't just betrayed me by omission. He had inherited silence like a birthright, and now he was questioning it out loud. That mattered. That wasn't nothing. I refolded the letter, carefully smoothing its edges, and tucked it back into the envelope. I didn't feel rage. I didn't cry. What I felt was something quieter, recognition. That he saw me. That maybe, for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of clarity alone. I didn't write back. Not right away. I didn't text. I didn't call. I didn't forward the email I drafted a few nights earlier about the house's heating system still being under my name. I just walked over to the drawer in my bookshelf, opened it slowly and placed the envelope inside next to the lease, next to the spare keys to the studio, next to that empty frame that now held a Polaroid I'd taken of my new living room on move-in day. I closed the drawer gently. It wasn't closure exactly, but it was something like peace. Something like the soft click of a door you no longer need to slam shut. I stood in my new space where no one had to tell me what belonged to me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone in the truth. It was Christmas Eve, and I woke to strings of fairy lights reflected across the walls of my studio, their gentle glow a quiet reminder that this holiday would feel different because it would feel like mine. I decided early that I wouldn't drive back to the old house. Instead, I made peppermint tea, lit a single candle on the breakfast bar, and opened my laptop with a lump in my throat at the thought of dialing in. I hesitated, staring at the start video call button, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat, uncertain of what I deserved. Finally, I clicked it and my screen filled with the familiar scene I'd refused to claim, as home for so long my parents and James gathered around the Christmas tree tinsel, reflecting in their eyes. Mum's cheeks were red, Dad's sweater, rustic and warm, James leaning forward tentatively. "Merry Christmas," I said softly, and they all responded. Their voices catching in the shared silence, I felt the past flare in my chest decorations, laughter, small fights, then exhaled through it. I told them about the peppermint tea, about a stray cat that had run past my door earlier, even about how I nearly lit the candle with clouded certainty in my hands. Dad laughed a slow, genuine sound. James smiled. Mum's gaze softened, and for a moment her eyes glistened, and I thought I would see her cry. Then she spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "That house. It hasn't been a home since you left." The words struck me like gentle snow, cold to the touch, but soft in their honesty. I felt tears blur my vision, but I kept blinking, holding my posture upright. The camera caught my face, and I watched something shift in their eyes, a recognition, a kind of regret. James's shoulders slumped, and Dad pinched the bridge of his nose, silent in almost solemn relief. In that instant, the emotional distance I'd carried between us thinned, and I realised I wasn't shrinking any longer, our relationship was. I answered, voice steady, but heart pounding. I felt that too. "That's why I'm here, even though I'm not there." I paused, listening to the soft hum of the heater in the background, and their quiet inhalations through the call. We went on to talk about other things, Mum's homemade gingerbread cookies, whether I'd come by next summer to meet her new tree lights, the neighbour who kept bicycling past our steps back home. The conversation wasn't polished, it was warm, it felt real. And when it came time to go, I glanced at the clock's red numbers and said softly, "I love you." "Merry Christmas." My mother's lips trembled as she whispered, "We love you too." I clicked end call, and the screen went blank. I put the laptop aside and looked around my empty studio, a single candle flickering beside unpacked boxes, the scent of pine from my childhood lingering in my throat. I walked slowly to the window, pulled back the curtain and stepped close. Outside, the street was quiet, draped in frost, lit by yellow street lamps that made the snow glow like spilled starlight. I breathed it in and felt a weight lift from my chest. I wasn't home in the way I once was, but I was home in a way I had never been before. And as I stood there, watching the snow settle on the city, I let out a long, even exhale, my lips curving into a small smile. This Christmas I didn't go back, but I came home. I held that truth in my heart before I closed the curtain and walked to bed. The wooden sign arrived in the mail on a rainy Thursday, wrapped in tissue and ribbon, hand-burned letters on smooth maple Carson residence. Since 2025. I ran my fingers along the grain, feeling the groove of each letter, like the quiet persistence it took to get here. It was simple, sturdy, nothing ornate, exactly how I wanted this new chapter to begin. The apartment door, still unadorned until then, looked almost unfamiliar, like it was waiting for a name. My name. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, holding the sign at my chest, remembering how many rooms I'd lived in without ever calling them mine. Childhood bedrooms, where I kept my voice, small college dorms where I never hung photos that house, the one I paid for lived in, repaired, that never had my name on the deed. And now this. It wasn't just a nameplate. It was a declaration I am no longer invisible here. I peeled the backing from the adhesive strip, lined it up, and pressed it onto the centre of the door until it held. Then I stepped back and looked at it. I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I just stood in the stillness and let the truth settle. No one had to give me this. I had claimed it. That night, I made dinner, quietly played an old jazz vinyl on my second-hand record player, and left my phone face down on the counter. I didn't need distractions, I was home. As I cleared dishes, a notification blinked and I flipped the phone over without thinking. It was a message request, from a name I hadn't seen in years, Lena P., one of my former students. I opened it expecting a holiday hello, but it read, "Miss Carson, I saw your new place on Instagram. I know it's random, but you're still the teacher I want to be. I've never forgotten how you believed in me when no one else did." I set the phone down again, heart full, in that specific, rare way when someone reflects your quiet strength back at you. I never told Lena what had happened. I never posted about the house or the way I left. And yet, somehow the version of me she remembered, the calm, clear one who listened without judgment, was still real, still visible. I walked back to the door and looked at the sign again. Carson. My father's name. My brother's name. My name claimed now, not by inheritance, but by choice. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the heater and the gentle spin of the ceiling fan. I stood there and let it all in. Not the noise of justice, not the echo of apologies, but the fullness of peace. The kind of peace that only comes when you stop waiting for permission to exist. I didn't need them to undo what they did. I only needed to know that I could stand where I am and say, I am here. Fully, unapologetically. And if you too have ever been overlooked, not because you were weak, but because you were too strong, if you've been asked to understand while others were handed everything, remember this, you're not alone. You were never less. You were simply ahead of them. Healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet reclaiming of your own name, the steady rebuilding of boundaries, the deep breath you take when you realize you've earned your own space. Right now, many people are exploring therapy apps that guide you through family trauma journaling, prompts that surface hidden truths, or virtual support circles that remind you vulnerability isn't weakness, self-care isn't indulgence, it's survival. If any part of this story resonated with, you know that transforming pain into strength starts with one small step, like asserting your worth, or reaching out for help, or simply whispering to yourself, I am enough. If you believe more people need to hear this, please subscribe and join our quiet community where healing takes root, one story at a time.